All right, good evening. We're going to jump right in. If you're doing something, keep doing something. No worries. We're praying for Mike. Mike's got those shingles, and he's probably not very comfortable right now, right, Elizabeth? No. But you know what?
He's had those childbirth moans. I'm like, oh.
But he still came up here and worked on Saturday in that trailer.
Daddy came today, too.
That's crazy. That man's dedicated.
That's the mindset we're talking about this morning.
That's right. That's that mindset. That's that generation that endures. That's like, hey, it doesn't matter how I feel. I got a job to do. I'm not taking a mental health day. I'm going to knock it out.
Hey, what's that?
No, is that like timeout or something?
Yeah, that's like timeout. They were ready for timeout.
All right. Well, we are in, we're going to experience week 2 and week 3 today. I've got some slides for you just to try to hold us to our mindset. If we remember, we built a framework, right, of how to study the Old Testament. And we're going to look at the Old Testament from the perspective of the economies, the dispensations that God is choosing specific groups of people to teach them lessons about themselves, to reveal himself, and then the covenants, the promises. And we're going to see today the reasons necessitated by the covenants. And it starts with creation, and then what comes almost immediately after creation is the reason why God needed to intervene and why God needed to and say, all right, I made it, you broke it, here's how we're going to fix it. And so this is the framework on how we're studying the Old Testament, because we talked about building momentum, right? We talked about building momentum and driving towards restoration. And so we're going to see the pieces that will begin to fall into place. But I just wanted to remind you, that's what we did last week. I'll get you a copy of last week because I know you guys were not able to be here. But it was basically how to study the Old Testament. And we talked about framework. So if anybody needs those, just let me know in between and I'll print them out for you. So we now jump into the early chapters of Genesis. Okay, and the early chapters of Genesis explain much about what we see in today's world. You can understand from Genesis chapter 1 through 11 a lot of what we see today. It explains, because a lot of people have questions. A lot of people say, why is this here? The questions that destroy confidence in people. The questions that... the mysteries down through the ages. Why are we here? How did we get here? Where are we going? Why are things so bad? Those questions are answered in Genesis chapters 1 through 11. And so there's beauty, but there's also brokenness. And there's beauty and brokenness in equal amounts. If we spent the next 10 or 15 minutes and I asked what's beautiful about this world, we could fill that time, right? We could fill that time with God's creation, with the love of a mother, the young love, a child's trust in parents.
A double play.
What's that?
Double play.
A double play. 6-4-3 double play, right? A perfect game. Just the best things in this world, right? But we could also spend the same amount of time if I asked the question, what's broken about this world? And we could do the same thing. And again, why those things are there? It's all explained in Genesis chapters 1 through 11. The scriptures don't reveal... let me back up here. God created the physical universe in 6 literal days, and he rested on the 7th. Now, we are not told how much time passed before the fall, but that fall took what God had called good and broke it. It wasn't broken beyond repair, and our ensuing chapters begin to tell the story of redemption, of how God planned to put those pieces back together. And we're going to be able to see with our framework, with the structure of dispensations and covenants, understanding those things, we're going to be able to see, okay, I see where this piece goes now. Okay, I see where this piece goes now. And I see where that's going. I see how God took that and began to work it out to point towards this. And so a lot of that is caused by sin. Sin has God intervene, and God turns that sin around and says, I'm using that to drive towards redemption. And we're going to see how those pieces fit. And that's just the amazing God, this big God that we serve. We have this idea of image and likeness. And I think it's important for the believer to understand image and likeness. Those terms, I think, are used interchangeably, but I think they're distinct. We're going to spend a little bit of time on that and why they're distinct. But when Adam had children, he bore them in his likeness, not in the likeness of how he was created in God's likeness. He bore kids in his likeness. Why? Again, those answers we're going to find in Genesis chapter 3. Image of God was lost, and only portions of God's likeness remained. The course of history is the account of God's plan to restore his creation to its created rightness when he called it good. Again, this momentum, this drive of restoration. The fall led to a corruption of God's creation that spread to the point where God had to judge creation and start all over with a faithful remnant. This was both gracious and righteous judgment. We'll take a look at that. Noah's descendants followed the pattern of men's failure, rejected God's command to be fruitful and to spread out and fill the judged earth. Man unified in an attempt to worship the creation. We're going to see the phrase in Genesis, to make a name for ourselves. The drive to make a name. And then God had to step in again. He had a threefold judgment there. Now this resulting judgment, we're going to see another piece falls into place. That'll lead to week 3, which is going to be our second hour tonight. The promises that are made. But man's sin necessitates that one piece that had to be there for God to be able to make promise. Okay, so we're going to take a look at that. Again, the resulting judgment reflected God's plan to redeem creation because it laid the groundwork for the next step in his plan. All right, so let's talk about this idea of beauty and brokenness, right? What best explains why the world is both beautiful and broken? By the end of this class, you should understand the 4 pillars of framework that connect these early dispensations. The dispensation of innocence, the dispensation of conscience, and the dispensation of human government. These early dispensations that are almost come and gone in the first few chapters of the Bible here. So we're going to be able to see this. Let's take a look at our 4 pillars. This is actually what we're going to be studying in this first hour. First of all, creation, right? Then fall, then flood, then nations. And so this framework here, again, will remind you about what we studied a little bit last week, and you have your charts that you can refer to, right? The 7 dispensations and the 5 covenants. You have those charts, right? So we're going to take a look at the first 3 dispensations today. The dispensation of innocence. And again, when I talk about a dispensation, I should be looking for basically 4 things, all right? I'm looking for a master. I'm looking for a manager, a steward. I'm looking for a revelation or a rule of life, all right? And then I'm looking for a household. Who basically is going to be held accountable, all right? The master, the steward, or the manager. What's the revelation or rule of life? And then who does this apply to? And then wrapped up in that rule of life is also a judgment if that rule of life is not going to be kept. So we should be able to find those 4 things in every dispensation. Again, the first 3 dispensations found God teaching all of existing mankind about themselves: innocence, conscience, and human government. I'll remind you, dispensations do not mean a different way of salvation. Salvation has always been conditional upon belief. We're going to see that in hour 2 tonight, based upon the redeeming crosswork of Christ, and always by grace. what seems to change throughout the years for salvation is the object of faith. But through progressive revelation, we can actually look back and see that that was Christ revealed progressively throughout history. For example, salvation for Adam and Eve and their descendants was the head crusher of Satan, the promised seed of the woman. The object of salvation under Abraham in the Abrahamic covenant in the dispensation of promise was the earth blesser, right? How through Abraham's seed. The promised object of faith under the Davidic covenant is the throne sitter, right? The one who's going to sit on the throne throughout history. And all of those, we put those all together, and we get now to minor and major prophets lead into the Gospels, and now we've got a name for this person, Emmanuel, God with us. You'll name his name Jesus, the Messiah, the only begotten one of the Father, God in human flesh, right? And so now the object of faith is the kingdom bringer. John the Baptist says, repent, for the kingdom of the heavens is at hand. And the disciples believe when they have a net full of fishes and they see water turned into wine. They believe that now deity is in flesh because they have the Messiah. For you and I, we just add the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say, from 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 6. The death for our sins, burial, and resurrection of this serpent crusher, earth blesser, throne sitter, promised Messiah, Christ, Jesus Christ. And so progressive revelation. So salvation has always been about that. These dispensations are God's economies. They are God's administrations, ways for him to give a rule of life, to reveal himself, and to teach people about themselves using his blessings. Him dispensing his property through an economy, choosing a manager. So this is our idea of that dispensation chart. And we will take a look at that. But this section right here, we're going to look at 4 pillars in the first 4 chapters, all right? Creation, fall, flood, and nations, okay? So we start here with creation. Order, image, and likeness. So Genesis tells us that man was made in the image and likeness of God. We see Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we believe God used 6 literal days for creation. We don't believe in theistic evolution or millions and millions of years. It's all laid out. We actually see what God did and then a commentary from Moses on how he did it in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. So we see some general and some very specific information given to us in those verses. So don't be confused if you happen to see, well, did he make man in chapter 1 or did he make man in chapter 2? Yes. It's just information that's being given in commentary form here. But let's talk a little bit about this idea of image and likeness, okay? Adam was created in God's image. We can refer to your handout that you have right here. The image is God's glory garment. God wears light like we wear clothing. We see that in Psalm 104, verse 2. God created Adam and Eve in a state of light, which the psalmist described as crowned with glory. God crowned man with glory and honor. And so, since God is a spirit and not a physical being, his image does not refer to a physical likeness. God doesn't have a strong Roman chin and a dimple in his cheek, right? Because we're not talking about physical likeness. So it referred to Adam wearing light like God wears light. This is, I believe, one of the explanations to why Adam and Eve didn't realize they were naked. And so before they sinned. Scriptures in Psalms, again, they're helpful to understanding the state that Adam and Eve were in at creation and then what they lost after the fall. Now let's fast forward to one of the things that we talk about in 1 John. What is one of the things that we've talked about in 1 John about what God is doing for us? We've learned that God is light and in him is no darkness at all, right? Remember that verse from earlier in 1 John? What is God putting in you What did he put in you at the moment of salvation?
His quality of life.
His quality of life. We call that eternal life, right? His Spirit carries it, the indwelling Spirit. This is part of the full restoration process where God is putting light in us. Now, again, that's not visible light, but it is visible to people when I get out of the way and the Spirit produces kindness, goodness, faith, joy, peace, the character of the Son. What is that going to look like when I get a glorified body? Well, we had a little preview of that on the Mount of Transfiguration. That includes some light, all right? And so we have this shining form where we have, so when, I don't know much about my glorified body. I know it's not going to be limited the way this one is, praise the Lord, all right? I know I'll be able to get rid of these knees and I won't groan when I get up and sit down, all right? But there will be some light involved. That I do know, okay? And so this is the idea of what God is now restoring in us today is a little bit more of that image, a little bit more of God's quality of life. So let's shift gears.
I'm sorry. Do you think it'd be like how Adam and Eve was when he first created them?
Could be. Again, I think that's the principle of what we're seeing here, this idea of restoration, right? God gave it to us. It was good. We broke it. And now through redemption, he's giving it back to us. So I think I don't see any reason why we would disagree with that, but I'm not going to preach it dogmatically because I don't have any scripture for it. But let's shift gears a little bit. Let's go from image to likeness. I think this is what when people say, I support life, right? I'm against abortion. I'm against murder. Why? Well, because man is made in the image of God. That was true, but I think what they really mean is that man retains God's likeness. And I think this is what we see here. Adam was also created in God's likeness. This means that mankind is able to think objectively outside the realm of his experience in a manner similar to God. Therefore, to insult men is to insult that part of them which is still similar to God. Animals have emotions, and animals can only operate within their sphere of experience. They can only relate to what their senses can experience. Man has a spirit in addition to a soul. Again, animals are limited in a certain way. God created Adam with a spirit and a soul. He was able to think outside the realm of his experience. That gives, according to our slide here, man a dignity, a purpose, and an order that doesn't exist in the animal world. And so there's a distinction there. There's something, again, that God was doing that is just a little bit different than what he was doing with the animal world. There's going to be something that I should be on the lookout for when I study anthropology versus zoology, right? There should be something a little bit distinct. And this is where the lines get blurred in world system psychology, right? They want to blame every disorder and brokenness that man has on, well, we're just animals. We're just animals. It's just a mental disorder. No, as we're going to see, it's sin. It's sin. Man has a soul, he has a spirit, and he has a body. And when he used volition to sin, that's something that's different than what we see in the animal world. So Adam had children that were not after God's likeness and image pre-fall, but in broken state after the fall. Adam passed on his sin nature to each of his children. After Adam sinned, the body began to die as God said it would. Man's understanding was darkened. Man became dead in his trespasses and sins. He possessed and lost after the fall an outward manifestation that was characteristic of God, likeness, and glory. Now, again, like we mentioned, God has made it possible that believers today can show forth a quality of the glory. Not all of it, but a part of it. Again, in this pre-glorified state. We bear the image of fallen Adam. God is personal, sovereign, and purposeful. Creation has order, distinctions, roles, goodness, and likeness of God grounds human dignity, human purpose, and then, again, this idea of stewardship. I need to do something because of how God created us. That creates an obligation for us. And this is, again, this idea of moral right, moral wrong. And you hear people arguing this all the time. Why is this standard right? And you talk to an atheist about this, right? And he'll try to just run it in circles. He'll just try to run it in circles. He won't let you nail him down to, well, this is because this is how we were created. This is the idea of accountability. The atheist and the agnostic wants to cast off the idea of a supreme being because they don't want to be accountable for their behavior. They want to be able to explain away this sense of obligation that we have because of how God created us. And it is so important that we understand this. All right? Let's go ahead and I'll throw a couple of discussion questions out here. Let's take a few minutes. How should likeness of God shape how we treat people, how we treat bodies, how we treat truth, and how we treat work? Let's talk about some of these concepts. This idea of likeness of God, this idea of obligation, how should it affect some of these things?
Like the idea of work, God had work, and he did it good, it was perfect. And if we're going to be like him, we should be cognizant of that, as you do everything as unto Christ. Well, why? Because you should, because if you're going to be Christ-like, why be slovenly or why?
My mom used to ask me, did you clean your room? Yes. My answer was yes. And then the follow-up question was, is it company clean? And I'd be like, so I cleaned, but there was capacity to do it better. God created a capacity that I needed to fill. Why? Because of that capacity was the likeness of God. If I can do a job and I can do it halfway or I can do it well, which one should I do it? I should always do it well. It matters. And that's why it matters.
Part of our nature is to have joy in doing a good job. That's how God created it.
Right. So that's work. Anybody else have any ideas there?
His characteristics.
Okay. Well, how should that, God's characteristics, his likeness, how should that shape how you treat people? How you treat bodies, or how you treat the idea of truth?
If his quality of life and his characteristics are flowing through us, then we can show them his quality through love and patience and kindness and long-suffering towards other believers and even outside the believer realm.
So, and a lot of times it's counterintuitive, right? Someone does wrong against you, the natural urge is to return evil for evil, right? But that's not like God. We have the capacity to think outside of our experience, not to just react according to my instinct. And if I am just an animal, then survival of the fittest should be the law of the land. Right? Should be. But I'm not just an animal. I've been actually formed and created with purpose, with dignity, and that should affect how I treat other people. It just should. It should. And so this is a seminal understanding, and this is why we walk away from the creation with this understanding. Okay? Let's talk about, I'm going to throw this up here just to give you something else to look at while we talk about this idea of domination versus exploitation. What's the difference between dominion or domination versus exploitation? When God told Adam, be fruitful, multiply, and have dominion over the earth, right? This was to take care of the garden. This was before the fall. He was given authority. And so this idea of dominion versus exploitation, you have a thought on that?
I just was thinking stewardship. That translates to stewardship.
Okay.
Management.
That's a good way to put it. What goes along with that?
Responsibility. Accountability.
Well, what is exploitation?
Using a misuse.
What can I get out of it? And I'm going to throw it away. So my thought is, Jennifer will spend a little bit extra money sometimes and put a stack of paper plates up in the cupboard. Why? She want to do dishes. So sometimes it's just easier to grab the paper plates and to serve on that and then throw it away afterwards, right? As opposed to stewardship, which is like, no, I'm going to do the plates. And it's a little more work, but I'm not spending any more money. It's a little more labor, but I have to care for this plate. I have to wash it. I have to make sure it doesn't crack. I have to make sure it doesn't break. That paper plate, you throw it away, right? But I can reuse that plate multiple times if I care for it properly. So one is stewardship and the other is exploitation. So you tell Jennifer the next time you talk to her. I'm just kidding. I'm going to get myself in trouble. But again, one's the idea of just burning through it and say, don't worry about that. We're going to throw that plate away. You don't have to worry about it, all right? Sometimes it's how renters take care of versus owners take care of their property, right? Sometimes renters are like, yeah, I don't care. Somebody would come and knock on my door when I lived over on Ridgeview and say, such and such and such and such roofer, such and such and such and such termite, such and such and such and such gutters. And I'd be like, yeah, we're just renters. And they'd be like, oh, okay. And they'd walk away and I'd close the door. I don't care about the gutters we have because in 5 years, I'm not going to be at that place, all right? I'm not going to pay for termite control on a house that I'm renting in versus if it's my home, I want it to be around in 20 years, right? So I can hand it off to my kids and I can have this is the idea of dominion and stewardship and care versus exploitation. So that's a thought there. Okay, now let's talk about the fall, okay? Let's talk about this idea, the fall, sin, death, and moral disorder in the anatomy of a sin. We're going to go to James here in a second, but I want to talk a little bit about how Satan approached Eve. And this is essential to understand because Satan hasn't changed tactics. He approaches us the same way. He wants us to begin to reevaluate what we know to be true and to get us to doubt God's goodness. Try to get us to doubt that God has provided everything that we need for a peaceful and a good life. He went to Eve and he said, yea, hath God said, ye shall not surely die. And again, it wasn't the moment she ate of the fruit that she keeled over and stopped breathing, but God was faithful and true to her. She began dying the moment she broke God's commandment and gave to Adam, and he did eat. And that day, they were separated in a way, and their body began to die. And so, understanding that she went through a mental process. I want somebody to read all of that verse. Chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. Who can read for me?
Okay, I got you. Read both.
Yeah.
For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat.
So we saw the serpent in verse 5 guide her. Take a look at this.
You said this is James chapter 3?
No, we're in Genesis 3. Sorry. We're going to go to James in a second. My apologies. We'll go to James 1 when we look at the anatomy of a sin in a second. But I want us to see how we're going to connect what we see here in Genesis 3 with what we're going to see in James chapter 1. Read verse 6 again. Sorry.
And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food,
Saw.
and it was pleasant to the eyes,
Pleasant.
and a tree to be desired to make one wise,
Make wise.
she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat.
So these are all half-truths. Was the fruit beautiful? Probably. Okay. That didn't mean that it wasn't prohibited, that she should have left it alone. that it wasn't healthy for her, that it wasn't good for her. Was it going to give her added information? Yes, but it was information God didn't want her to have. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil was not to be theirs right now. God wanted them to trust him, not to have open-eyed, clear understanding of everything. This was God's plan for them. All right? Did it provide sustenance? Probably. It probably was good for food. However, God had provided everything they needed with everything else in the garden. So those three things were half-truths, and that's how Satan comes at us. Satan comes at us with whispers, and we're like, well, can't argue with that. That's true. That's true. Sin is fun. But that's not the rest of the story, is it? It destroys. Now let's take that information. Now let's go to James chapter 1. Let's go to James chapter 1 and let's take a look at verses, I think we're looking here at verses 13 through 15. Who can do some reading for me there? You want to start, John?
Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. And when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death.
All right, let's take a look at this idea. There's some truth that we have here that we need to be able to understand, because every sin that's ever been committed follows the same pattern. Okay? First of all, the origin. It doesn't come from God. Let no man say when he's tempted, I am tempted of God. Because God is not tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. God does test. We're going to see that in Genesis 22. God does give us trials. God does allow the evil one and his minions to present us with solicitation for sin. But he does not. He is not the source of that. It's important that we understand that. Okay? We see in the next verse that man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. So let's answer the question. If God is not the source, what is the source of temptation? One of our three spiritual enemies. One of our three spiritual enemies is trying to solicit us to sin. It's trying to convince us to sin. And so these ideas, these thoughts get put into our mind, get thrown before us by one of the three spiritual enemies, and sin begins. The first step of what will become a sin is when this idea, when this thought comes into my mind. And here's where we need to be very careful. The fact that a thought comes into your mind is nothing that you need to confess. This is not something, it's what you do with that thought that when it becomes offensive to God, when it becomes unrighteousness. And so, I mean, I can say, I used this exercise before, I say the word pink elephant. And it's not your fault that some kind of image of a pink elephant came into your mind, right? I don't know if you were thinking of the Heffalumps from Winnie the Pooh. I don't know if you were thinking about the drunk elephants from Dumbo. I don't know if you were thinking about Barnum and Bailey, somebody spray painting and putting a... I don't know what you were thinking of. However, if in 10 minutes you're still thinking about a pink elephant, that's on you. That's not on me. That's not my fault then. Why? Because you took that thought that I put in your mind and you took ownership of it. And you started going down a trail and you're like, a pink elephant? That's weird. All right? And so now you're off in La La Land and you're not thinking about where we're going. That's because you took ownership of it, right? And what does James say? A man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust. Now, when that desire becomes yours and you consider it and you're like, okay, that's not a bad idea. And then you make a determination. So at that moment, we've got offense to God. We've got unrighteousness. We call that a trespass. Okay? Any number of things can now come in between me and completion of that determination. God could say, yeah, I have need of you later on today, Steve. I'm not going to let you sin today and make it impossible for me to sin. He could do that. God's done that before. All right? If I need to get in a car and go somewhere to do that sin, I get in my car like you with your truck and I push a button and nothing happens. It's like, okay, I guess I'm not going anywhere today. I guess I'm going to work on a car. Okay? God can interfere that way, right? I can change my mind. I can decide, I can find the way of escape and I can make a different choice. Okay? That thought was still offensive to God because my attitude was wrong. I had an incorrect determination, but I don't have anything to confess yet because I didn't sin. I didn't do anything. Okay? And so we see when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Read the next phrase, John. After the word enticed.
Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin.
Stop. When lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. Now I have something new. It's not just this determination. It's not just this idea of this is what I'm going to do. Something new. I actually acted on it. That idea conceived and brought forth something new. The new thing is my behavior. That's sin. And sin, at the end, always brings separation from God. That's ultimately what death is. Separation. And so, when a person takes action, a sin has been committed, and I need now confession to restore fellowship. Adam took the fruit from Eve and rebelled against God. Let me see here. We're going to get back there. Adam's fall. So Adam did what? He knew exactly what he was doing. He chose, because of unbelief, because of rebellion, he chose his wife over what he knew to be the right thing to do. And that's sin. So Adam's fall broke creation. Man was alienated from God. It created disillusionment and fear as Adam and Eve then hid themselves from God. That's how you knew something was different. In the cool of the day, God was walking in the garden. Where's Adam and Eve? What changed? Well, their fear. Now you have fear. Because what's been broken? Sin has consequences. The relationship between God and man was broken. Things could not continue as they were. God says to Adam and Eve, how did you know you were naked? And then now we have the blame game starts. Comment?
Is that why sin is consequential in our lives now? Because his quality is in us, and then when we commit sin, we face the consequence behind that sin?
I don't think that's why. I think sin is consequential because sin is consequential. It's just the nature of that. That's what it is. I wouldn't say that that's exactly why. I think, to answer your question, his nature being in me is what makes me bent towards it. That's what broke me, is that. And again, I was as guilty as he was because I make the same decision all the time, right? I'm a sinner because I sin, right? But I did receive that bent perversity from my father, who got it from his father, who got it from Adam. And so that's all there. So, yes, sir.
I have a question. Whether Adam ate the fruit or not, Eve had already sinned.
So here's the thing. The Bible never says that Eve sinned. It says that Eve was deceived. It labeled her action differently.
Well, she disbelieved God. She disbelieved God, and then she ate of it, and then she gave it to her husband. But I think didn't sin already because she already disbelieved or sinned.
Again, if you take a look at Romans, it says the first sin was Adam.
He's responsible.
Yeah. Well, God calls what Eve did with different words. He doesn't call it sin.
He cursed both of them.
That's true. He cursed the serpent, and that's true. And we talk a little bit more about that in hamartiology, in our anthropology and hamartiology class. It's a very interesting conversation. It really is. It really is. So we see here what previously was fellowship was now an adversarial relationship. And so we begin to see, here we go. This is what we want to do here. What broke and why it matters. So we see the pattern. Going back to what we saw in Genesis chapter 3. Yea, hath God said. Ye shall not surely die. Doubt of what the truth was told to her is usually where these things start. I'm not even going to, because if I truly trust in what God says, I'm not even considering anything else. So it's beginning to doubt God's word is where this begins up here. To even create space where that next idea can fit into. If I have full trust of God, there's no space for anything else. I'm not even considering anything else. So this distrust of God's word, then I begin to distort God's character. Eve believed the lie that God's holding out on you. He's keeping something from you that'll make you wise. He hasn't provided everything you need. And I just want you to think about the last time you made a really bad choice. If you break it down, you're going to find these same things. You're going to see that there was doubt of what God said to be true. And then some kind of distrust of God's character. Some kind of doubting that God has actually given you what you need. So you felt you needed to act independently of God to get that. All right? And then comes disobedience from God's command.
And at what point was Adam or Eve directed not to eat of the tree of life? Is that further?
I think when he put them in the garden to dress and feed it, he actually told them, of every tree you can freely... Is that the end of chapter 2?
Genesis 31 says, and he said to the woman, or Satan says, as yea, hath God not said, you shall not eat of every tree.
So he had to have addressed it.
He had already addressed it.
If you go back to chapter, you'll find it in chapter 2, I believe.
Chapter 2, verse 9, we find the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the midst of the garden.
Verse 17, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die.
Yep. There you go. There's your command.
It says there he commanded the man. But
He
not
told
the
Adam.
woman.
He probably expected Adam to tell Eve.
We know how that goes.
Yeah.
Careful.
So what happens now is, again, I've got this sin. God dealing with this sin, as soon as things are broken, God begins to deal with them. We see the blame game, right? Adam says, well, the woman you gave me. And Eve says, well, the serpent, right? And so God says, okay, I'll curse the serpent. I'll curse the woman. I'll curse the man, but I'm also going to curse the ground.
I just want to point out something.
Okay.
Let the Bible speak for the Bible.
Uh-oh.
And it says in 15, Genesis 2:15, and the Lord took the man and put him in the garden of Eden to dress it and keep it. And the Lord commanded the man, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat. And then 17 about don't eat the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then in 18 he says, and the Lord said, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helpmeet for him.
Eve wasn't even around when that command got given.
No, he didn't. He dropped the ball.
He was the steward. It was his job to jar.
Yeah.
So, and I think a lot of what you guys are saying is why Romans says what it says when it talks about sin coming into the world. By one man, sin entered into the world, and death by sin. So death passed upon all men, for they all have sinned. But again, let's get back on track here, because the next guy speaking in the next hour, he's really jealous of his time. We got to be careful that we don't take any of his time. So we have blame, shame, hiding, blame shifting, and death. The world is fractured, broken at every level. You got between God and man, that relationship is broken. Adam and Eve, that relationship is broken. And now God even curses the ground. Man's relationship with woman with childbirth, man with the ground. He's cursed the ground, right? Everything is broken. However, as God is giving his curse, he also provides hope. He also provides this path to redemption in verse 15. right? He says that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. And he gives a promise. Victory through the woman's seed. Now, these are going to be important words. Land, seed, blessings. In our next hour, we're going to talk about those three things popping. So keep those three words in your mind. They're going to be prevalent. Land, seed, and blessings. These things are all the way through the rest of the Old Testament. Very, 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 very important. Land, seed, blessings. Okay? And so God says, I'm providing redemption, and he also covers their nakedness. He kills the first animals and provides them skins. And so God is gracious even in his judgment. That's something we also need to remember all the way through, okay? We don't have a lot of time for this, but I want you to consider, where do we see hiding and blame shifting today? We do it all the time. You guys were just doing it. You guys were just blaming the men in your lives, right? But accurately, right? You're just accurate representation, right? But that's okay. That's what we do. We do it all the time, right? But I want you to see what's going on in our world. Where do we see hiding and blaming culturally in our world?
Oh, you mean like with crime and judicial system and everywhere?
The LGBTQ movement is hiding.
Oh, yeah.
It's hiding perversity and dressing it up as a different lifestyle choice, an alternative lifestyle. That's hiding. But it's hiding in wide open. Abortion is hiding. Accountability and responsibility for your actions. And it turns into murder. Right? These things are still happening today. Adam and Eve did it. Every human is trying to do it today. In fact, society, how much money is being spent on lobbyists to get laws changed so that things that are against God are now legal?
Right.
Hiding, blame shifting.
I see the things that we've seen in Sodom and Gomorrah that we're still representing today in the same aspect.
100%. He talked about Sodom and Gomorrah, all these things going on today. I talked about the whole psychology. Psychology. They're taking mental disorders, but it's really sin. They're calling it, well, alcoholism. It's not your fault. There's a gene for that. All right? When homosexuality became prevalent, what was one of the things that we cautioned as a nation? We were like, if you're not careful, this perversity, sodomy, pretty soon they're going to say that pedophilia and bestiality are okay. What are we hearing about today? You're seeing studies that basically say that pedophilia is not, it's just a disorder. It's the same as anything else. And it's disgusting. It's sickening, right? So Genesis 3 explains, remember I told you the first 11 chapters of Genesis are going to explain a lot of what's going on in our world today. A lot of what's broken and a lot of what's beautiful. Okay? We got to continue along here because we got another pillar to talk about. We've got to talk about this idea of the flood. Now there's some language in Genesis chapter 6. All right, I'm not going to go deep into it, but I believe that the sons of God, which are spirit beings, cohabitated with the daughters of men and corrupted all human flesh, except for Noah and his family. Mm-hmm. And so things had gotten so bad that seed, right? God, in order for God to keep a covenant, he needs to do what? He needs to preserve the seed of the woman. Because that's where our Redeemer is coming. How did Satan try to attack that? He tried to corrupt all flesh. But there was a remnant. Mm-hmm. This is going to be a repeated story. Satan's going to do this. Satan's going to try this. Most people are going to fail. But God has a remnant. God is faithful. We're going to see this story over and over and over and over. So believers will disagree as to exactly what the sin was that corrupted all flesh. But it led God to purge the world of 99.9999% of all its individuals. Noah and his family survived. And the flood shows God's holy judgment is not a metaphor, but it also shows grace. God could have just said, you guys are terrible. I'm done with all of you. But then his promise to redeem would not have been accurate. So in his judgment, he is also gracious.
He could have done that with Adam and Eve.
He could have.
Right? Strike
He
them
could
out.
have.
Starting over.
He could have.
Let's try this again.
Right? And so at the end of the flood, right, God provides this Noahic covenant, right, where he says, I'm not going to destroy the earth anymore like this. But what does he also say? Well, he begins now the seasons, right? He creates an order. Now we have the tilt of the earth on its axis, right? Now we have this canopy gone. Now we have these storms. We have this, again, this is the establishment of an order that's going to lead to other things in the future, all right? And so we have this platform of stability now for history that's moving forward. And I mean, that's a lot of information to just talk about in about 4 or 5 minutes. But again, we have this man sinned. God had preserved. There's a lot of information in that story. The 120 years it took him to build the ark. He's called a preacher of righteousness in the New Testament. You've got again all this evil that he's surrounded with, and he keeps his nose to the grindstone, and he just does the job. He does the job day after day after day after day after day. And then we have something else that happens when he gets out. When he gets out, he takes these animals and he sacrifices. He begins to worship. And so now we see something that God established, killing of animals to provide skins, to provide blessing. Who sinned? Adam and Eve. Who died? The animals. Substitutionary atonement. You see these principles driving forward that God is beginning to teach. He's like, okay, Noah, get out of the ark. And Noah offers up thanksgiving and he worships. He worships God through the altar here. All right, so we have judgment and grace and stability all here together, right? Holiness responds decisively to evil. This is something that God is always going to do. And he did it in this way. The flood shows judgment is not a metaphor. Sin and violence provoke God's righteous wrath. Grace, this remnant preserved. Humanity's recommissioned. Noah finds grace, and they're given a responsibility. What is it that God tells Noah and his family to do when they get out of the ark? Fill the earth to its extent. Fill every corner of the earth. Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. That's going to be important here in a minute. The Noahic covenant secures the stage for history. Seasons, harvest, rainbow sign guarantee a stable world for God's redemptive plan to unfold. All right, a couple more discussion questions. Why does Genesis connect human evil with violence?
The end result of sin.
Yes, it's the reason for that question. Why is there so much suffering in the world? The answer is not because we have a mean God who's toying with his creation like a kid with a magnifying glass burning ants. That's not the God we serve right now. There's evil in the world, there's suffering in the world because of man's sin. We have violence because of man's sin. And God connects that. Who can read 6:11 for me?
What?
Genesis 6:11.
I can do it.
Vivian's right there.
The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence.
So God takes this corruption and he equates it with what? Violence. The one causes the other. There's an equal balance right there, an equivalence. We have one because of the other. And the remnant prepares us for later prophets and restoration. Again, this is Noah. This is the preacher of righteousness. This is one man standing against the current of wickedness and preaching a message that he's been given from God, with an understanding that everybody else in the world is going to do something different. But as for me and my house, like Joshua said, we're going to serve the Lord. Doesn't matter what's going on, what's popular in culture. Doesn't matter what's happening. Well, God said it's going to rain. Well, what's rain? You're crazy. God's telling you something's going to happen that's never happened before. Noah's like, yep. And so we're going to see this picture again and again and again, multiple times. One man standing in front of the powerful many and giving the truth. We see this over and over again. Here's a good picture of the deluge, right? It's a picture of people trying to do what they can do to save each other, knowing that it's going to end badly because they should have listened to Noah. All right, now let's keep going. I think we can push through here. I'm going to take a little bit of the next guy's time, but we'll still get you out of here at 9 o'clock.
He only has one page.
That's true. He only has one page. He didn't prepare as well as I did. All right, let's take a look at this next idea. We move past, and there's a lot of interesting characters between the flood and the Tower of Babel, but this is the next major event here. All right, we see here the rise of nations. Why is that important? Because again, what's our framework of studying the Old Testament? Well, it's dispensations, right? God choosing the first three dispensations. The household for innocence, conscience, and human government was the entire population. God's dealing with the entire human race. But in week 3, in our next hour, it's now this hour, but in our next study, we're going to see God elects, he chooses to deal with a smaller group of people. He lets the Gentile nations go their way with their conscience, with their rule of human government, and says, hey, give it your best shot. I'll circle back around and see how you're doing here in a few thousand years. But he begins to now deal with this special group of people. He begins to deal with Abraham and his descendants, and he begins to now reveal himself more to a small group, a smaller household. And that's going to happen in the dispensation of promise. But before we get there, I need to have the rise of nations. There's still no nations. Everybody's all the same now. So let's get into this story. Babel is humanity's attempt at unity without God. Unity without God is actually, we're going to see in the next slide, is idolatry. Unity without God is idolatry. Churches are doing it all over America. They're deciding to have their churches. They're unified, but they've left God outside. That's the church at Laodicea. That's why Revelation 3:20, God says, I stand at the door and knock. There's churches who have decided to put women in the pulpit, to put gays in the pulpit, to throw away the gospel and bring in a social gospel of social reform and social justice. And God's outside. That's idolatry. That's false worship. And so this was their attempt to make a name for themselves. We see that in Genesis 11, 1 through 4. All right? Let us build us a city and a tower, and let us make us a name. And so God, we're going to see here in a second. Let's go ahead and take a look at what's going on. Let us make us a name. Human pride, human autonomy. We just said what God commanded Noah and his descendants to do. Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. That actually means to replenish the earth, to fill every corner of the earth. Well, we see the exact opposite in Genesis chapter 11. Paul gives us a good commentary on what's going on here in Romans chapter 1. If you want to read Romans chapter 1, verses 20 to 32, you get basically a picture of what's going on in this part of the world. That man who knew God decided to abandon God and to lose his gratitude for what God had given him. Noah comes out of the ark and in his gratitude offers a sacrifice. Well, Noah's descendants, not so much. They decided to abandon God. So God gives them over to a reprobate mind. They build a tower. All right, let's take a look at what this tower is. One of these ziggurats, right? Now again, Grandma's flannel graph probably told you that they were trying to get to heaven. They were trying to get up to the sky. That's a poor translation of what was going on in Genesis chapter 11. This was a temple that was designed for celestial worship. This was the beginning of what we would call astrology. They're studying the stars. They fashion the stars into the likeness of creeping things, like maybe a lion, Leo, or maybe a scorpion, Cancer, or maybe this or this or this, right? They are now taking the heavens and they're worshiping them. And in this temple, we have basically celestial worship beginning. And so they've decided that the stars and the arrangement of the stars, they're going to dictate my future. They're going to tell me what kind of personality I have. They're going to tell me who I should marry and who I'm compatible with, instead of God telling me those things. So they've abandoned God, so God abandoned them to their lusts. And this is where homosexuality and all this perversity comes from. Because when man is left to his lust, it just degenerates and degenerates and degenerates and degenerates and degenerates and becomes more perverse and more perverse and more perverse. But going back here, again, part of what God did, they decided, God, we're not going to spread out. We're going to unify without you. And so God said, nope, I'm going to threefold judge you. So he judges them by language, he judges them by ethnicity, and he judges them by separating the continents. And he says, okay, I'm going to spread you out. You're not going to spread out, I'm going to spread you out. I'm going to confound your languages. And so that first several months, I'm going to go find someone whose gibberish sounds like my gibberish. Okay, I don't know your gibberish. Oh, I hear somebody over there. I understand what that means. I'm going to go find him. And people had to begin to now separate. There's where our ethnicities start. So they move away from each other. And as they move away from each other, God separates the continents. Now we have continental drift. And so that's that, along with probably a previous ice age, is how people got to every corner of the globe. All right? And so all these things make sense. This is, and what does this do? Now I've got nations. And one of these nations is in Ur. And again, we see this. Where do we fall here in our dispensational chart? Well, we again did innocence, we did conscience, and when we did human government, there's our reminder again. Different ways of economy. We're not talking about different ways of salvation. It's not what we're talking about here. But we have these three dispensations already taken care of. Innocence, the household was Adam and Eve. Conscience was Cain and his descendants. And God says, that didn't work out very well either, right? They were governed by their conscience. And Cain brought a sacrifice that was different than Abel's, and those guys didn't get along. Cain says, my perversity is more than I can bear. We have judgment there. And then God sets up Noah, and we have human government. And God says, okay, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. That's your standard rule. That's your rule of life. And they break that apart. They break that apart. So, all right, to wrap it up here, our four pillars. God creates everything good. All right, man messes it up. Man messes it up to the point where God has to judge all flesh. But God leaves a remnant, and even with that remnant, through man's sin, God establishes a very important piece of the puzzle that's going to lead us into Genesis chapter 12, the rise of nations. And so we see how these pieces are now fitting. This momentum is driving. Why is it important that I now have this one group of people that God begins to work with? Well, we're going to see that in the next hour. Seed, land, and blessing. All right, that ends week number 2.